Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Whip Union, and in this one there are several advances. The Russians have managed to advance in the Hryhorivka section of the front line and south of Pokrovsk. They have advanced within Chasiv and in direction of Terny. The Ukrainians in turn have managed to advance in the Kursk region, but have managed to push back the Russians slightly through the heavy fightings that are taking place within the region these days. Starting out in the Kursk region, the Ukrainians have managed to push the Russians back towards Kursk, following the Russian advances through the forest patches and their foothold gained within the forest lines east of the settlement. The Ukrainians are now pushing back to secure the supply lines to the pocket that is located northwest of Malaya Luknia, where the Ukrainians are attempting to fight over the settlements of Novaya Soroshina, Orlovka, and Pokrovki. The Ukrainians here are fighting extremely difficult battles with the Russian forces, which are attempting a counterattack to regain control over the Kursk region. The Ukrainians are here looking to secure the flanks and delay the Russian recapture of the region as much as possible. Moving on to the Terny direction along the Serbis river line, the Russians have advanced within the eastern parts of the settlement following the capture of the forest patch and road to the southeast of the settlement. The Russians are now pushing through to connect with the northern parts and gain full control over the settlement, with heavy fighting taking place here as well. The Ukrainians have a significant presence within the settlements of Hryhorivka and Terny, as well as the forest lines to the east of them, where they're trying to prevent a Russian capture of these two settlements to prevent the Russian push towards Outskirts from concentrating too large of a force. The Russians would then be able to push from the northern flank of Kursk, advancing on a wider front, from which the Russians can then push into the flank of the Ukrainians' positions within Hryhorivka forest area. The Ukrainian positions within Hryhorivka forest area are extremely crucial for the defense of Liman and the general area. Their presence here are supplied by the Ukrainian forces in the Siversk direction and through Kursk and Liman to the west. The Russians are here looking to cut off one of the supply lines by pushing towards Kursk, but at the same time they've also been doing a lot of positional fighting in the Verkhnokamensk direction. The Russians have attempted to push through some of these settlements such as Hryhorivka and Hryhorivka, however the Ukrainians have practically abandoned them. Their positions are mostly associated with the fortified positions near Siversk, from where they are fighting the Russian forces from. The Russians are unable to penetrate this line of defense, which has allowed the Ukrainians to have a secure supply line in and out of the Hryhorivka forest area, which is threatening the Russian offensive capabilities in the direction of Liman, preventing the Russians from taking control over the city. Therefore, the Russians are focusing on the Serbis river line, where they have been advancing through the northern flank of it, gaining full control over the eastern bank of the river line by capturing Makiyivka and several other settlements to the south of it along the river line to improve their positions towards fighting over Kursk, which would limit one of the two supply lines in and out of the Hryhorivka forest area and improve the Russian positions here in the Liman direction. Liman is important for the fighting over the northern parts of the Donetsk region and is comparable to Hryhorivka in terms of defensive capabilities and logistical hub for supplies for either side that controls it. That means as long as the Ukrainians control it, they're able to supply the eastern bank of the Outskirts river line. If the Russians are to control it, they'll be able to launch offensive operations towards Slovensk from the north and flank Siversk from the northwestern direction, significantly threatening the situation for the Ukrainians in that section of the front line. In the direction of Chasiv, the Russians have advanced both to the north of the city in the direction of Hryhorivka, gaining control over the majority of the settlement, capturing a fortified position of the Ukrainians on the eastern parts of it, and reaching the northern outskirts, which is the final remaining parts remaining under Ukrainian control. The Russians already control the fortified positions along the canal, and with control over Hryhorivka, the Russians will start fighting over Hryhorivka, advance further along the canal, and potentially launch offensive operations across the canal towards some of the firing positions of the Ukrainians north of Chasiv. The Russians have also managed to advance further within the northern parts of Chasiv, where they're looking to gain full control over the fortified positions and northern district of the city, which would allow the Russians to fight over the firing positions of the Ukrainians here near Maiske and flank the city itself from the rear, fighting towards Hryhorivka and Chervone. In conclusion, it will significantly improve the Russian positions in the direction of Chasiv, but also limit the supplies of the Ukrainians in and out of the industrial zone and the apartment complex area, which they are using as a staging ground for their defensive operations, and preventing the Russians from concentrating a significant amount of soldiers here within the city itself. This means if the Russians are able to reach the western outskirts of Chasiv, gain control over the supply line, they'll be able to fight over and gain control over the industrial zone and the apartment complex area, which will lead to the inevitable collapse of the city. In the Pokrovsk section of the front line, the Russians have advanced here to the south of the city, where they've managed to cross over the Shenske, start fighting over the fortified positions on the northern bank of the Soloniy River, and has allowed the Russians to start fighting over the northern bank as well. The Russians have been stopped in the eastern parts near the Sivka due to the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the northern bank of the river line, preventing further advances. With this crossing, the Russians are able to flank the fortified positions and start fighting over them themselves, and this will improve the Russian positions here to the south of Pokrovsk. At the same time, there's some positional fighting in the western parts of Zelene, where the Russians are looking to gain control over that settlement, use it to stage further offensive operations along the defensive line of the Ukrainians south of Pokrovsk. The Russians have also advanced further within the settlement of Novovasilivka, gaining control over the farm area, as well as another street on the eastern parts of the settlement. The Russians are here advancing along the Solona River to gain control of Novovasilivka from the southern and eastern directions. The Russians are here continuing their offensive operations to gain control over Novovasilivka and advance along the Solona River towards Uspenivka and towards the Dnipropetrovsk region south of Udashne and the main supply line of the Ukrainians between Pokrovsk and Zaporizhzhia city. The Russians are here advancing along the northern parts of the western flank of Pokrovsk towards Vovkove and Solone, from the eastern direction through Shevchenko to gain control of these settlements and threaten the supply line, and at the same time they're advancing along the southern bank of the Solona River towards the Dnipro region. Further south, the Russians have advanced further within Novoyelizavetivka, which is located here on the southern flank of the river line, but the Russians are also advancing along the fortified positions. With the river line to the north and the fortified positions under their control to the south, they'll be able to start breaching the Dnipropetrovsk region and advancing along the main highway between Pokrovsk further to the north towards Zaporizhzhia to the west, where they'll be able to advance into the Dnipro region, flank the fortified positions, and gain a foothold on the supply road further north. It will also allow them to flank the fortified positions from the northern direction and push towards Novopavlivka, which is to the rear of the fortified positions of the Ukrainians further south near Kurakhove. The objective would be to gain control over the supply lines going in and out of the Hryhorivka section of the front line, limiting the supplies of the Ukrainians in the area and improving the Russian positions and significantly deteriorating the Ukrainian positions in the southern parts of the Donetsk region. The Russians have also advanced within the settlement of Shevchenko, gaining control over the fortified positions on the eastern outskirts of the settlement and within the eastern parts of it. Now fighting is taking place over the fortified positions in the northern and western parts of the settlement. The Russians are also advancing and fighting along the Slovianka and Petropavlivka direction with recent advances through this month. But the Russians have their main focus around the southern parts towards Kurakhove itself as they close the pocket from the northern and southern directions through advances towards Andreevka, Olyakli, and Konstantinopol as well as Rusliv. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.